Now, we're going to travel back into the past because last night the Iranian President Hassan Rouhani tweeted out a reference to the number 290. That was a riposte to President Trump talking of 52 Iranian targets for retaliation. 52 being the number of US hostages taken by Iran in 1979. But what was the 290 that President Rouhani was referring to? We had to look it up hastily last night. But in Iran, the number 290 is better known. It refers to the number of civilians killed when the US shot down an Iranian passenger jet back in 1988. It was a case like MH17 when the pro-Russian separatists shot down a Malaysian flight over Ukraine. Back in 1988, a US warship, the USS Vincennes, seemed to think the plane was a Tomcat jet fighter. Well, Rudy Pahio, a former US Navy combat cameraman, was filming on the ship that day. Here he is speaking in 2018 to the World Service Programme Witness.
One of the lieutenants, I went up and asked him, I said, what are we doing? He goes, you're going to see some missile action. And I went to the operations specialist who was watching the scope, and he's watching the missiles because he can track it off the radar, and then he sees it hit the target.
We had it, got it. That was a dead on. Ethan Orange down. Back it up.
But one of the, I believe it was a lieutenant who was on the port side, said that it seemed like the debris that was coming down was larger than a F-14 Tomcat. And they found out like 15, 20 minutes later that there was an airliner missing. And so that's when it was like, what? Airliner missing? We didn't shoot an airliner, we shot a Tomcat, I thought.
Well, it was notable the Iranian president referred to this 32-year-old scar on US-Iran relations yesterday. Hasn't healed. We thought we might just visit the history of it. We're going to talk to a reporter who was reporting on it at the time. But very briefly first, Rana Rahimpour is a reporter with the BBC's Persian service. And Rana, just talk us through how remembered that is in Iran today.
Evan, I grew up in Iran. I lived there for 25 years. And every year, for every 3rd of July, people went to the Persian Gulf, families of those passengers who were killed, and they put flowers in the waters in their memory. And there were state programs and state television. So it has been part of the history. And we as Iranians, we have grown up with it. Whether the youth right now living in Iran is worried about it, or whether it's on the top of the list of things that they think about, no. But it's definitely been part of the rhetoric between Iran and US.
You might liken it to the American memory of the hostages being taken in.
Exactly. So it's something that both countries refer to over and over. And to Iranians, it's very similar to the 1953 coup, which was staged by the United States and the UK. And in every debate and every discussion between Iran and the US, many Iranians, including politicians, refer to it. And they still haven't forgiven.
But do they accept it was an accident?
No, they're not
convinced
it was.
They don't. Okay.
No. Right. No, they say it was an act of war and it was intentional.
Right. Rana, thank you so much for that. Let's talk to Fred Kaplan, who was defence correspondent for the Boston Globe when the plane was shot down. He's now an author and columnist specialising in foreign affairs and defence. And thanks for joining us, Fred. Fred, just tell us what happened that day and what the different accounts are, or any controversy over the accounts of what happened that day.
Well, it's largely forgotten now. When I wrote about this in the context of the Malaysian shoot down, nobody had ever heard of it. But it's a big deal in Iran. What happened was there was a tanker war going on in the Strait of Hormuz. This ship, the Vincennes, kind of wandered into it, had a very aggressive commander, a guy named Will Rogers III. There was a brand new radar system on board. It mistook a passenger plane for an F-14 jet fighter and shot it down. Now, it was an accident. 8 years later, it took 8 years. It took two different presidents. President Clinton finally expressed his regret and gave compensation to the families of the victims. But before then, the Pentagon engaged in some of the most shameful lying about this that I'd ever seen as a Pentagon reporter.
Their initial account was not a truthful account of what had happened.
Yeah. I was at the press conferences. They said the plane was descending at a very fast speed. It was squawking on a military transponder. It was flying outside of commercial boundaries. And yet, 7 weeks later, the Pentagon released a report, and they said, no, the plane was going up, not down, at a much slower speed. It was squawking on a commercial transponder. It was flying well within the commercial lanes, and yet, in that report, they still blamed the Iranians and said that the United States, the commander, had performed honorably. And a few years later, he even got a Medal of Commendation for his performance as commander.
That is true, is it? That he got he was actually...
a certificate of merit, and the certificate stated explicitly his time as commander on the Vincennes.
In terms of compensation, because if you shoot down a plane, accident or not, I mean, you as your government has to pay something to the people who've been, the families of those who've been killed. And America did agree compensation in 1996, so 8 years later.
Yes, it was about $180 million, half of which went to a fund for the families of those killed. It was 290, including about 66 children, I think. I mean, it's unusual because we usually don't shoot down passenger planes like this.
I mean, the Russians had shot down a Korean one, hadn't they, some years before?
Well, yeah, the Korean Airlines
007.
Flight 7, which they mistook for an intelligence plane, and there had been an intelligence plane in the area earlier that night, and the KAL plane did, in fact, accidentally pass into Russian territory. I mean, that's still no...
What is your conclusion on it? As you look back on it, Fred, I mean, clearly the Iranians don't forget it as quickly as the West forgets it. What's your sort of final take on it?
Well, I mean, it shows what can happen. I mean, again, there was this tanker war going on in the Strait of Hormuz at the time, and this commander wandered into it, and he expected. In fact, I get the impression that he rather savored the possibility of conflict, and he mistook something for something that it was not, and then the Pentagon covered it up for 8 years. I see it as really one of the most shameful incidents in post-Vietnam U.S. military history, actually.
Fred Kaplan, thank you very much for talking us through that.